Good evening, buenas noches. Welcome to our February 28th board study session. We will get started with roll call. Director Barrows,
Here.
Director Smith,
Here.
Director Decker,
I'm here.
and Director Sproul will be with us a little bit later today, but I am also here and we're all in attendance. And we have quorum, and I will now turn this over to our superintendent to lead us through our meeting.
Thank you, Director Zavala. I will drive us through several topics tonight with different presenters. And throughout the evening, please just interrupt if you have questions. We do have time built in at the end of each kind of section for questions or comments or just thoughts. As you know, we try to use these study sessions to connect to some of the priority goals that the board established at the beginning of the year. So our first presenter tonight and information is related to the budget. And so I will turn it over to Brett.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Snell. Just want to kind of provide an overview of our timeline as we sit here end of February. A lot of things still have to happen. We're working hard on the budget as we speak, but as we preview the coming months, wanted to give you guys a few kind of mileposts that we've identified. So as we head into March, the main focus is going to be locking down that enrollment forecasting. Most of that's been done, but there's always a few tweaks that come through at the last minute, especially as we're talking about staffing and preschool programming and some of those transitional kindergarten concepts that maybe aren't in lockstep with our historical forecasting methodology. So that would be locked down. And then we obviously that transitions into the staffing. And so we're working hard on that as we speak as well. And then as we move into April, we would hope that we kind of have at least some preliminary scenarios on those, and we can turn our attention to the legislature, who we know through their budget bill is almost certain to have an impact and corresponding reactions from us in terms of what they're proposing in terms of new funding or altered funding. So we're expecting the legislative budgets from the House and the Senate. I think the Senate's actually going first this year, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of March. So we would need a week or two to analyze those proposals. And as you know, those are just proposals at that point in the session. But we like to kind of understand what's the range of possibilities in terms of the impact to the district. So that would be hopefully in a position to share in April. And then if we're being very optimistic, even though it's a biennial budget session, that they finish on time, which would allow us to have the final legislative budget sometime in May for analysis. And then we would also then start to be able to focus on what are our long-term impacts of both enrollment, staffing, and legislative, and all of the other pressures that are identified at that point. We would try to integrate that into we can afford to do this for this year, but we need this to happen in the second year. We need this to happen in the third year and the fourth year. And again, that's a requirement of the state, but we also think that's going to be very helpful in our processes as we look to hopefully more gradually than some of our peer districts transition away from the ESSER funding that so many of us have benefited from over the last couple of years. So we talked about kind of that stair-step approach. And so we would like to be able to kind of really look at some specific scenarios on that in May. And then that would allow us to then kind of come back with some recommendations after hearing some feedback from you all through those earlier sessions in April and May, to be able to say, okay, based on the feedback that we've heard, the available resources that we can reasonably forecast, we propose to make these changes in the 23-24 budget year. And then in July, we would have the official document that we would ask you to approve then in August in both the 4-year model as well as the 1-year model, so that would be kind of the fully constructed budget document for your consideration. And then again, August would be the time when we would ask for final adoption via resolution of those official state documents for both 1 year and 4 year scenarios. So that's kind of what we've teed up, and a lot of work for all of us. And we'll be having asking for a lot of your time and attention to provide guidance as we navigate through all of these, but just kind of wanted to give you the preview of the road ahead. Happy to answer any questions or respond to any curiosities.
Thank you, Brett. I'll keep us moving then to our next topic this evening. We wanted to provide you with an update on the 2 new elementary schools and what's been happening since you adopted policy, and then we put into effect some new procedures that included how to fill these schools. And so I will turn it over to Janelle to share a little update with you.
All right, good evening. I would like to share an update with you about our schools of choice, in particular. VITA, also known as, the real name is Vancouver Innovation, Technology and Arts Elementary. And then I'd also like to share about information with you about Ruth Bader Ginsburg Elementary as well. So our VITA will serve students in kindergarten through 5th grade using a project-based learning model, developing skills particularly in critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, innovation, and communication. And the instructional environment at VITA will be child-led, hands-on, and discovery-based. It's really based on the Reggio Emilia approach, and this approach values uniqueness of every child and how they access their learning environment. And transportation will be provided at VITA, and we are using the lottery-based model for admission, and I'll talk a little more about that in just a moment. But I'd also like to introduce, next slide, please. Ruth Bader Ginsburg Elementary. And RBG is Vancouver's first dual language site, full school. It will focus on providing service to students in Spanish and English. We'll start with kindergarten through 1st grade and build on that as years progress. Our objective is really to create an environment where our students can become bilingual, biliterate, and bicultural. And like VITA, RBG is a school of choice, and it's open to all students across all elementary students across the district, using the same lottery selection process and providing transportation. I think Christy might want to provide some additional information for you.
Thanks, Janelle. I was just doing a tiny cameo here. We put up on the screen some potential quotes that we are looking at to etch. I don't know if you've seen the quotes that are etched into the furniture at King. It would be similar to that. And our project manager, Whitney, has been working with RBG's daughter to come up with these quotes and how they want to represent, or how we want to represent her mom there. So started with dream, believe, achieve, and then translated it into Spanish, and then open a book and let your imagination grow. So that one will probably go in the library, but wanted to give you a sneak peek. We're meeting, I think, on Friday to finalize that. So if you have any thoughts or questions about that, let me know. Thanks, Janelle.
All right, next slide. So if you want to learn more about VITA or RBG, VITA will have its next open house on March 15th at 5:00 p.m. There at the site. And RBG will have a parent information session. We'll hold that at the Bates Center, April 19th at 5:30 and May 3rd at 9:00 a.m. And those application processes or application windows are currently open, and they'll be open. VITA's first round will be open through March, and we'll have a second round, and then RBG is opening through mid-May, May 12th to be precise. Next slide, please. Okay. I also wanted to highlight that, as you know, during the February 14th board meeting, you approved the equity-based selection policy for our schools of choice. And really what that policy states is that the district will provide all students an equitable opportunity to participate and benefit from our district's academic extracurricular programs, including our programs of choice. So based on this, the selection process for our schools of choice, both elementary and secondary, will allot a designated number of openings based on student neighborhoods, population size, and different risk factors in those communities. And this selection process is an effort to assure that our enrollment is aligned with the enrollment of the demographics of the greater district. We used this process for VSAA and ITech, and students were notified who were admitted last Friday, February 24th. And we're going to use this process for VITA and RBG as well. And final notifications for those programs will go out, will be complete on May 19th. And so we're excited to see how these recent changes will impact our student enrollment. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Janelle.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christy, for popping in as well during that presentation. We're very excited about these opportunities. A lot of work is going into making this happen, and looking forward to the fall when these schools, obviously VITA has had students this year, but when both schools have their own student populations moving forward. So next agenda item that we have tonight is a highly capable update. Committee update. You've been, Christy's updated you a couple times throughout this process, and so we thought it would be a good opportunity to loop back with you. So I'll turn it over to Christy.
Good evening. I am here sort of out of order. Honestly, we were supposed to have our last advisory committee meeting last week, but we got snowed out, and then we thought we would hold it on Zoom, and then we were asked not to. So you guys are getting a sneak preview of what we're going to be sharing with them tomorrow as we wind down this first part of our process. So this is just information. I think you already know this, but this is how we set the stage. And we really wanted to provide a lot of information for parents to consider and community members to consider, so that when we make recommendations, people are well informed about where we're going, what it means when we say we want to do this or not do that. And then that last bullet there, we got to an outcome that I'll share with you towards the end here that we didn't really expect. We went in thinking that we would work with a continuum of services and have the committee recommend to us which one was their favorite. And in the end, that's not how we arrived. So I'll share that with you, give you a little cliffhanger there as we go through this. About the third meeting in, we came up with a belief statement. This is sort of a lesson learned for us. We wish that we had started with this. I think it would have helped frame our conversations a little bit better. Does anybody want to read it? This is what I make the people do when they come to the committee. They have to read out loud things. So are there any victims who would love to do that?
I'll read it. Just a minute. At VPS, we endeavor to develop a system where students identified as highly capable are provided optimal learning opportunities within a continuum of services that enables them to recognize and develop their unique talents. We believe students' ability and achievement data are drivers for determining services provided to each student. We collectively commit to support a purposeful continuum of services that is equitable, feasible, and sustainable for a diverse group of highly capable learners. All VPS teachers will be supported to help each student become an expert learner.
Thank you, Sandra. So as part of our introduction routine, we go through several slides that they've all seen before, and we read these aloud. And this really helped our team and then the committee get grounded in where we're coming from. So next slide. These are the options that we explored as we wanted to think about what, right now we have a mishmash of things in Gen Ed, anywhere from not much to quite a lot, depending on the school you're in. And then we have what we now know as our VPS self-contained model. These are all the things we looked at, and not only did they learn about each one of these and what it would mean, they learned what effect size means. So in research, like what's a more effective way to offer services and why. And then they also played around with fictitious children and tried to place those children in one of these service models that would best meet their needs based on what they learned. What we'll be doing tomorrow, we had them write their own little biographies of children, most likely their own children, and then they're going to try and do that again with their own children according to the services that we've explored. So next slide. When we, let's see, the meeting before last, now it's been like 4 weeks almost, we looked at this little graph down at the bottom, the continuum of services, and we had them mess around with all those ones that you saw on the signpost there. And they created their own continuums and they placed their kids on there, and then we had them rank them. And what we came up with, these are how people voted or how frequently they chose the services. So Jeff, if you click again, you'll see there should be some animation here. These are the ones that came up repeatedly. So everybody chose these. We're like, okay, great. These need to be in the continuum. Self-contained was already in there. We knew that that would be there somewhere, but they also really highlighted the curriculum compacting and the cluster grouping. And if you click again, then you can see these also differentiation and subject acceleration were also part of it. So this is what 15 people came up with. So the whole time we've been talking to them, we've also been, if you go to the next slide, trying to keep them focused on what is going to be equitable, feasible, and sustainable for us as a district. Tried to really ground them in the equity policy and what that meant. And as we did that work, I think initially it became pretty clear to people that what we're currently doing doesn't offer an equitable educational experience for all kids who are identified as high-cap learners. We also wanted to be sure that it was feasible. It was something we could afford on a timeline and rollout that we could plan for successfully, and that whatever we put into place was sustainable over time. So rather than a continuum on the next slide, we said, well, why can't we do it all? It really fits in there. So what we really ended up doing is putting like, these are all the things that would happen in a gen ed classroom, and they go across from least intensive to most intensive. And then there's the most intensive, we're redefining as our new model of self-contained. So it starts with universal design for learning, which is, if you're an educator right now, you probably hear about that constantly, but we're we're in sort of a year zero of our rollout. And then we have a 3-year plan that aligns with the work we're doing around instructional practice, around inclusionary practices. So that'll be our foundation for how do we approach learners with their variability, and including kids with IEPs, kids who are learning English, and kids who are identified as highly capable. And then some of these things, cluster grouping, multi-age, those are ways to put students into classes where they will be with other kids who are similar and might have similar learning profiles. A lot of this is going to be really determined by how we identify students, which we're also fleshing out more. This has been sort of an iterative process, and we're not done with it yet. One thing we expect to have happen next year is universal screening for kids. So we will be sure to capture more kids, and we'll use a nonverbal assessment so that kids who are learning one language or another, or learning multiple languages, don't get tripped up on that. So this is what we're intending to take back to folks tomorrow. I'm curious what thoughts you have on seeing that, how different or similar it feels from what we're doing now, and then I can share with you what I anticipate will be our feedback tomorrow.
Christy, can you maybe explain the self-contained column there a little bit too?
Yes, so we want to still offer self-contained. We want it to be a little bit more focused to meet the needs of kids who not only are identified as high cap, but who come to the table as what we commonly call twice or thrice exceptional. So they might have additional social emotional needs that haven't been successfully met in the gen ed classroom. They may test as highly gifted. We're thinking like 99th percentile kind of kids who not often, I guess that's a stereotypical way to say it, but frequently can have challenges with SEL and figuring out their peer groups. It would definitely offer curriculum compacting, subject acceleration, but we're thinking when you add in the 99th percentile and the twice or thrice exceptional, it really is getting at a group of kids that probably probably maybe wouldn't have had lots of success in a gen ed classroom, either because there's challenges with peers, or teachers simply can't keep up with where they are performing academically. And so we know we would want someone who's trying to either telescope curriculum or compact it. Does that help?
It does, thank you. And I may be jumping ahead too fast, so tell me to slow down if I am. But are we envisioning, should this be the model that we move to, like a self-contained classroom in every building, or are we envisioning to have campuses selected for that?
I think we
Like
would
maybe
have selected classrooms and campuses. I don't think that if we went with this criteria, we would have enough children
Right.
to
Okay.
have it everywhere. And you're kind of alluding to what we anticipate the concerns are that we'll hear tomorrow. As we've come along this process and looked at all the different models and really tried to ground ourselves in the equity policy and current research around self-contained, there's definitely a difference of opinion of parents who currently have kids in self-contained and what their experiences are, because they're more positive than when their kids were not in that program. And we acknowledge that that is true, not, for them and for other kids, because much of the stuff that's on the gen ed side right now, we really haven't provided teachers with the training and resources and practice to do that so that they can more successfully meet the needs of HiCap kids in classrooms. So I think there's going to be a rub there, because what we would be recommending is for the self-contained as it currently stands in VPS to phase out while we put in this self-contained. And likely it would be a multi-age classroom setting, because again, we don't expect that there would be tons and tons of kids who would qualify for this, but that's our thinking.
And then Christy, so what are you seeing as the span for multi-age? Like, are we talking third, fourth, fifth? Are we talking possibly 1, 2, 3? I mean, right now, the self-contained has been basically dropped down. Like when my daughter was in the self-contained, she entered in first grade, but I know we no longer have a first or second grade option for self-contained. So when we're moving to this model, how do you see that working?
Yeah, part of what we're looking at besides this is called talent development, where you're looking at your primary kids in K1, 2, and kind of keeping your eyes peeled for what kids look like. We definitely want to flag them. If we do universal testing, they should get flagged anyway, but we don't necessarily want to wait until second grade if that's the year that we decide that we want to start. So when we see kids who might benefit from some sort of acceleration or focus, we'll call that talent development. That's something we're thinking of. And part of what we might suggest for that group of kids in primary would be a K1, 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've been kind of batting around what would an older multi-age look like. Nobody likes the idea of doing 2, 3 together, or 2, 3, 4. So there's some 3, 4, 5, some 4, 5, some, so we don't have a set idea, Kathy. I think we're thinking, what would it look like, and where are the standards most common, and where would the takeoff points be for curriculum compacting?
Okay. Having done multi-age, I love it. I did a 1, 2, 3, and then I did a 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4, not a good idea for
Right.
a lot of different social and emotional reasons. But a 3, 4, 5, I think that, and I think you have to go personal experience, just throwing it out there, take it or leave it. You're the expert, I'm not. I think in order to make sure that it feels like a multi-age and not just a split level class, you kind of have to go to the 3 age group span or the 3 grade span, because you kind of push that. Like there's no way you can do a 1, 2, 3 split, right? You have to kind of push
Totally
it. So,
agree.
yay!
Yeah, I'm giving, and part of it, you'll see this on the next slide, but we want to capitalize on some people who might be interested in doing this and really get grounded in the research around multi-age. It is not a combo class. It's not a convenience. There's real direct strategies that we would use to maximize students learning from one another and modeling, and the teacher as facilitator. So we'd be looking for some early adopters who are interested in that way of teaching. I think we'd get some takers on that. I think it's
I'm pretty sure you
a
would.
fun way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Any other questions about this, what we're thinking we'll propose? And then if not, I'll show you what some next steps are that we're thinking about.
Well, so Christy, please, I apologize if I'm getting ahead of myself, but I appreciate all the work that you've done and this seems very thoroughly vetted and strategic. But you said it's going to take some work to get ready for kind of the clustering in the neighborhood schools. So as we phase self-contained out, are you going to talk to us about like the timeline of that phasing?
Yes,
Okay, so I apologize.
that's okay. You're setting me up. Let's do the next slide and we'll walk through it and we can always ask more questions. So the first thing is to finish our meetings tomorrow. That's our big thing. Our big thing, just like you said, Kyle, is what is the plan? Is it a 3-year plan? Is it a 5-year plan? How long is it going to take us to get that full continuum of services into Gen Ed in every school, so every kid who qualifies can access it, knowing that much like good teaching and strategies that you would use to support language development, good teaching strategies that support a variety of learners and HiCap learners are also going to support other children in the class, right? So that's the start. Like, is it a 3-year plan? Is it a 5-year plan? We're going to start everybody on universal design for learning, and we'll be paying special attention to what does this mean if you have HiCap kids in your class? How are you going to proactively plan to meet their needs? And that's a given. And then where we really want to get started next year is to pilot a couple schools who are interested in using a cluster model and another couple who are interested in some multi-age. So thinking that at a couple schools, we'll gather them together for their like PD for clustering and another one for multi-age so that there's some synergy for teachers and some PD access for us. We'll continue with the coaching that we've started this year. That's starting to get a lot of traction and we're using UDL as our jump off point for that. We are continuing, like I said, to work on our HiCap identification and universal screening. And then at some point, once we get our feet under us, we need to start a similar process for 612, which in some ways is easier because it's a lot of it's spelled out in policy, but then there's a lot of things to clean up in high school. For example, what does it really mean to be an IB student or an AP student, or to have a world language pathway as part of, you know, your acceleration process. So what are we missing? What thoughts do you have?
So I'm curious, next year we would potentially have a couple of these pilot schools around multi-age classrooms. Would those students reside within those school boundaries, or would we be able to facilitate some sort of transportation access?
We were thinking it would be in their home school.
Okay, so we would find a couple schools that would have the populations that could support.
Right. And we might start in one that doesn't, like, I think Philida often has a lot of kids. Well, that would be an easy group to pull and study, but we also want to make sure that we're offering opportunities where those opportunities haven't been so clear before. And using local norming, we can say, well, for universal screening, they scored this, but according to the academic milieu on that campus, they're still an advanced learner. And so we would still be looking to offer them the same kinds of opportunities. So, but this, honestly, the committee has been a ton of work, and it's helped the team really bond and get grounded in research and philosophy around equity and service delivery. But this, I see, as the bulk of our work, is coming up with what is our 3 to 5 year implementation plan and how do we train people.
So I know you just spoke to it, but I'm going to ask you to repeat it just because I've had a lot coming at me today. Because I know earlier we last, I think the last update you gave us, it was going to be like later this spring, like having to separate the middle school versus K-5 conversation. And I know you said we were going to like address middle school. Are we still going to kind of have an additional committee to evaluate that process, or because that was, I think, an area there was some gaps in what our services were.
Yes, and there are many people on the current committee that would like to continue and work on 612, But we'll probably also open it up for parents who are currently also there. And I anticipate the word will get out that we'll have additional people who would like to participate, but I think now we have a better sense of what the process could be like and how to help people get grounded more quickly. But I do anticipate that would be sort of a spring thing once we get our PD planning. You know, here it is already February, we're planning for August already, so we got to get that underway first, and then we'll come back and pick this up.
Of course, I really appreciate, it's a very detailed update, so I appreciate it. Thank you for all the work.
Welcome. And then we were thinking we would have a couple of parents, committee members come and talk to you about their experience, but since we haven't completed it, we didn't get to do that. So Jeff and I will chat about revisiting that and see.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from them. That would be
Testimony.
very cool. Just also not only to talk about, you know, their experience as far as like high cap decision-making going, but just the whole procedure, because this is sort of our first step into, you know, community advisory on, you know, using the equity policy and looking into research. So it'd be nice to see what their feeling about it is and, you know, how smoothly they felt it went.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people we hit the mark, and for some people, because it's not ending up being exactly what they hoped, that they're not going to like the process, you know. And so we kind of knew that going in, and we intentionally selected a lot of people who were currently in the self-contained program because we wanted to know, like, could we change your mind? And some yes and some no. And so, you know, I think the process was valuable. People got to hear, they got to speak, they got to listen. And I don't think we made everybody happy.
No, I mean, it would be surprising if you ever made everybody happy. I would say you were promising people something under the table if everybody came away from it.
Some people
happy,
stop
so,
trying, right?
yeah. But Christy, I do want to say, and I've said this to you before, but I want to reiterate what Director Sproul said. You have been amazing at the way you have led this charge that was given you, kind of thrown at you. And I really appreciate all the intensity and effort that you've put towards this and the research-based learning, not just for you and your team, but also for the parents. The whole process just has been wonderful for me to watch from the sidelines. And so I appreciate everything you've done. I know it was a lot of work. So thank you very, very, very much.
I'm going to pitch that right back to the team because they did a ton of work and a ton of preparation. And I have to defend Jeff. He didn't really throw it at me. He lobbed it softly and
Yeah.
he attempted, so I did.
You happen to be the one it hit, sort of like the bouquet at a wedding, right?
But thanks, I appreciate the feedback. That's really, it'll be nice for the team to hear. They've worked really hard. All right.
Thank you, Christy. We're gonna head to the next topic, and Christy and I will tag team this with different sections within, but this is our winter progress monitoring part. And the equity policy that you adopted, there's 5 times that we're checking in on student learning. And so in the early fall, late summer, we looked at more benchmark kinds of data like graduation rates and things like that, the annual report. And then in October, we did our first dive and we looked at some student learning plans, and we looked at the first round of iReady scores. And we also looked at panorama data related to belonging. And so we're coming back to some of those same indicators. The goal is that each year we would do this consistently so that each presentation, like the board and the public and all of our stakeholders, would understand that this is the winter data dive, and we're looking at our progress, and we're identifying opportunities for us to reinvest. And so right now it still feels a little clunky, but the more we do it, I think the better we're going to be at it. And it's also an opportunity for us to just listen to the questions you have and concerns that you have and curiosities that you have. And we might not be able to address all those tonight, but voicing those helps us kind of plan for the next data dive. So I'll get into it and then turn it over to Christy. We are focusing on student belonging and academic progress. That's the same thing that we focused on in the fall. And really, this overall question of how are our students doing, we're trying to answer on the academic side and also the experiential side. And on the experiential side, when we focus on belonging, we are using data such as the Panorama survey that is a norm-based survey that compares our students to students across the country and how they feel about their experiences at school and their advocacy. And then we're also looking at a little attendance data tonight. And then we aren't looking at exclusionary data, but the Equity Discipline Committee has been invested very heavily in that over the last several years. And that's another indicator of how our students are feeling a sense of belonging in our schools. So this arrow has been kind of our guiding focus for the year as we think about obviously student learning, but thinking about two strands that are leading us towards that. And the first is grounded in the equity policy and our inclusionary practices works. And it's really about the access and benefit for our students. And then the second lane is related to how we work together in professional learning communities, how we plan, how we instruct, how we assess that cycle. And as Christy mentioned in the previous presentation about highly capable, universal design for learning is a real important part of that. We know that we're going to have students that are on different ends of the spectrum, that we have different languages, that we have different abilities. And so if we know that they're coming to us, it benefits us to plan in advance for them. And so that's the general philosophy around that. Specifically, one of the goals that we had related to belonging was under our culture and climate goal. And we are working in partnership with our student advisory as well. They are focusing on belonging, and we had an update at the last meeting in February from Nora and Clark about some of the work that they're doing with that as well. And they've been looking at the same data. So Panorama data, just thinking about our culture and what we're trying to accomplish with this. As I mentioned before, these surveys are given to lots of students across the country, so it gives us a chance to like, is this good where our kids are at, or are we growing in this, or what's the opportunity that we see in this? And so we are definitely looking across different grade levels, and we're looking at it at different points in time. And so this first recap is the sense of belonging at the grades 3 through 5 level. And so just to reorient the board, there's a set of questions that fall under the umbrella of belonging. So it's not like one specific question, but as kids take the survey, it contributes to the sense of belonging. And so that's how they're getting this metric here. And you can see that we're really pretty flat over time. So this survey started fall 2021. We did a spring survey last year. We did a fall again. And now we're into the winter for the first time, and then we'll go into the spring. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. You can see there's kind of a pattern with the fall. And then there was a drop in the spring. So it'll be interesting to see, do we mirror that, or are we incrementally making progress as we move forward? And just again, how much students feel that they are valued members of the school community. So at this point, in our last data point, 65% of our students, so about 2 out of 3, were answering that way favorably. So how do we compare across the nation with this data set? And again, about 9 million students, 11,000 schools, 46 states. So it's a pretty good group of number. And we're right here at the 80th percentile for our elementary students. And so, that's something that is good, right? But we always want to continue to grow in this capacity. So this is the data, the same sense of belonging for our 6th through 12th grade students or secondary students, how much students feel that they are valued members of the school community. So same kind of stuff. Again, pulling questions together to try to get this overall indicator of belonging. And again, you can see a lot of flatness. And so the fall, 39%, fall again, 40%, spring, 38%, and we're sitting at 40% now. Also, that should be factored in here is that we don't get everybody that actually takes the survey, right? Like we ask them to take the survey and some kids engage in that and some don't. And you can imagine if kids aren't engaging in it, that it might be more likely that they're not feeling a sense of belonging. So that's kind of a double-edged sword. Again, how are we doing norm wise? And this is really interesting that our secondary students are at the 40th percentile. So something's going on here, right? It's interesting that that's so different because you would expect that as a district that we would have similar results in terms of you know, how our elementary students are feeling versus our secondary students. So this is something that we are exploring more, like what does this mean? Like how are we doing with this and how do we want to grow in this area? So I'll pause here and just see you know, if there's questions or if there's comments or curiosities, and then we'll move on to the next set of data.
The
Go ahead.
the data doesn't, it's just simply the questions, right? There's no like open-ended questions at the end. Is that correct?
Yeah, this set is based on like a certain group or cluster of questions that is feeding the
Okay.
belonging. So certainly there's other ways that we can pull information related to that sense, but this one in particular is looking at that set of questions in the overall category of belonging.
Yeah, because I mean, as you were talking about the difference between 3rd through 5th, guess compared to 6th through 12th, I mean, I would be curious, you know, if there was a way to kind of dig into that and kind of find out a little bit more. I would be curious too, and I know you guys can do this, but just kind of that breakdown, you know, because 6th through 12th is such a wide span. And obviously 40% as compared to, what was it, like 65% or something with 3rd through 5th. Like if there's any, I'm just thinking like the transition from 5th to 6th grade, or the transition from like 8th grade to 9th grade, whether that sense of belonging, whether we see like a lower sense of belonging as students are starting in a new school that might be bigger, there's more students, they don't quite feel as connected as like their smaller elementary school or smaller middle school. I just wonder if that's.
So Tracy,
Mhm.
at the equity committee, this last equity committee meeting that we were at, we looked at this data and we also looked at it broken down.
Oh, good.
And actually, that's what I was thinking too, but it's not the case.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's not the case. It's not that, I mean, that transition year definitely dumps from the previous year, but we lose people again, like the second year in, as I
Yeah.
recall. Now, it was a month ago, so, but I remember thinking, oh, that's so surprising.
Yeah.
So just FYI.
Yeah, I just wonder if like breaking it down a little bit more might help to identify some of those. Like, what can we do as a district? You know, like originally in thinking that it's that transition year, okay, what can we do to help students in that transition? But if there's something else, maybe we're doing a lot to support, you know, 6th graders and 9th graders in belonging, you know, but it's the 7th grade year or the 10th grade year, you know, or something where they're not quite as supported anymore. I don't know, like that might help to kind of figure out. I don't know, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I would like to see it like broken down, this particularly because there's so many different things that are happening between 6th and 12th grade that it would be interesting to see, and then like talk about, so why does that happen? Why does that, you know, what's the thought process on that? Tracy, did you have anything else to say? I guess the thing that just came to my mind is, so what are those schools that are in like the upper percentile? What are they doing differently than we are? Is what some schools, it's really working. So what are those schools doing? And are they transferable to what we're doing? Like we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel if there's a couple schools out there that are like really making it work. So it'd be interesting to see.
Absolutely. And within our district and outside of the district too, we're a large enough district that we probably have some variances there.
That's what my first question was gonna be, is just disaggregating the data across our own district to find those pockets where our data is a little different. On a recent site visit to iTech, and I know they've been really active with the panoramic data and using the data, but I was very intrigued because there was a connection of talking to the students regularly about the importance of the data and kind of making that a continuous circle. And I'm sorry, I'm now as a parent in the wheelhouse of middle school age children. So, getting students to take it seriously and making sure that this data is reflective of feelings. So that was my main question, was going to be, what's the participation rate that we have on these surveys? And I'm assuming we don't. It's not like iReady where we can red flag like people who are racing through the survey, but what would be the participation rate, and also disaggregating by school and maybe by grade band?
Thank you. Other thoughts? I'll move to the next indicator of the experience, and it's looking at attendance. And there's a lot of different ways to look at attendance. And in fact, OSPI is looking at it a little differently moving forward. And previously in the year, I gave you guys a memo about that, because there's, depending on how you look at it, you can just look at like how many kids miss a day, or what % of kids are, only miss 5% or less of the days. And so that it starts to be difficult to compare, because you'll see a number like 95% of our kids have good attendance. Well, if I define good being that they attend at least 3 days a week, right, that's not necessarily good. And so how we're looking at it tonight is just one way. And it's not exactly the same way that OSPI is looking at it. But we're looking at it by month, and we're looking at it for elementary, middle, and high school. And we're comparing last year to this year. And you'll see in this data that when we look at it, there's this dip. So the blue bar is the current year, and the gray bar is last year. It was interesting as we pulled this data that, you look at November, and that was our low point for elementary and middle, and then a little lagging on our high school. And we had kind of the tridemic experience of flu, COVID, and RSV going on around that time. And what we've seen now is this bounce back of a trend that's above the gray line. We also, though, saw at the high school level, again, our attendance was lower throughout. This is the first month that our attendance has been higher at the high school level. And attendance is kind of a tricky thing, because there for a while, like we had a lot of, just in public schools in general, it was like, everybody come to school, everybody come to school, you got to come to school. And then when the pandemic hit, we were all like, if you have any symptoms, don't come to school, don't come to school. And so it's kind of an interesting time to think about attendance. Obviously we want kids at school. That's the way we're going to be able to connect and instruct and give them experiences. And we're also balancing the health concerns. So just another data point. I'll pause on this one again.
So my first question was going to be, and you already answered this, this is our traditional way of looking at attendance. This is not using the OSPI formula. I'm curious, just for our secondary students, I mean, I think there's something interesting about who's showing up to school and who's showing up to class. Like if there was ever a way to track that down, breaking that out of the students we're seeing, but we're not necessarily seeing attend class regularly. And I don't know if that's something we are tracking. We're taking attendance in each period, but if that could be something we're differentiating, because of course it's great to connect with the kids every day when they get in, but how do we incentivize or support getting into the class?
Thanks, Kyle. Any other questions or thoughts about this? Okay. The other piece is as we build these presentations to just be thinking like, is this a slide that you would want to see consistently, right? Like, because I would love to have almost our slide deck once we've done this throughout this year that we kind of have like, it looks the same, right? So that we are orienting everyone to this and we can kind of see some trends over time. I don't want to like each presentation have a different set because then it's like, okay, but how do we know if we're doing better? If you like the way stuff is displayed, great. And if there's thoughts about doing that differently, let us know, and we'll build it that way.
It just one more, it might be nice to have like the juxtaposition of our kind of historic way of calculating attendance, which really is what % of our students are attending against, because OSPI is really looking at more of a trend of attendance, and maybe having kind of both views might be helpful in seeing how that impacts our student outcomes, student learning.
Yeah, especially with that, once the OSPI gets some traction and we have that a couple of times, right, to add that in, I think that would be great. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Christy, to talk a little about student learning part from reading and mathematics group.
Thank you. Let's look at the next one. So same arrow, and this time we're focused more on the learning experience. What are kids experiencing in class? What are teachers providing to them? And asking the same question though is, how are our students doing? Can you change it? So we're looking at student growth data, and we're going to give you just a tiny teaser on multilingual learner data, knowing that we'll go with, currently I believe we're planning to dive into our equity priority groups next time around. So that's just a tee up for that. So we are doing this because we need the formative data to see what do kids need, where do they need acceleration, what do we think about intervention, where is that going to happen, what are we prepared for? Our PLC process absolutely depends on the data that we get about each child and how to meet their needs. We want to look, although we're showing you primarily iReady assessments in this snapshot, we know that that's just a slice of the pie, and we expect teachers to use a variety of things from their own classroom assessments to curriculum-based assessments to PLC, common formative assessments that teams have created in order to inform both how's a kid doing and what happens in the PLC. And then we are working on building our data culture and our data literacy as a district. Part of that will include getting kids to own their data, to be able to say, here's how I'm doing in this. These are my goals to get better. I know how to get better in this, and I'll do that so that next time my score will look like this and it can demonstrate my growth. So that's a big piece for us as we think about how we collect and utilize data. We want students to be able to do that as well. Next slide. Okay, so we are looking from iReady at typical annual growth, and Kathy teed us up with a whole bunch of questions today, so we got a little bit more specific for you. So typical growth as calculated by iReady does a number of things. We're using the iReady diagnostic, and again, it's just one source of data. It's not enough to tell the whole story about any kid, but it is taking a look at a number of things. One is, where's point A where the kids started? And for that child, what would constitute a year's growth? Where do they need to be at point C by the time they're doing their spring assessment? Also takes into account kind of national averages, percentiles. So there's a lot of algorithmic type work that goes into what is typical growth. So as we're looking at it, we're looking at a year's growth, but also keeping in the back of our minds that 1 year's growth for a lot of kids is not going to do it. 1 year's growth, if you're already behind, is just keeping you behind, but in a new grade. So what we really want to see over time is, how are we getting kids to a year and a half, 2 years of growth with the instruction that they have in the current year they're attending school with us. Okay. And then this is really, iReady is about our Common Core standards, and the tool itself is getting much more developed so that a teacher this year, this is the first time we can get this report, I could go in and look at my kids and I could see kid by kid what grade level standard they have mastered, where they're proficient, where they're gaining proficiency. And we haven't been able to get that granular before. Hopefully our next step will be able to do that as a district. We still don't have that capacity with iReady, but we're getting there. So big picture, looking at math overall in the district, 50% of our kids are making progress towards annual typical growth. So if you take that diagnostic and the algorithm that says, this is for Johnny, what a year's growth looks like, 50% of our kids are on track to meet what the algorithm says would measure 1 year of growth for them. And then 38% of kids have changed placement. And Kathy asked, does that mean they could have gone down? It does mean that they could have gone down, but most of them go up. So that's good. And you can see currently what our distribution looks like. The green is where you want to be on grade level, more or less. Sometimes it's above, sometimes it's mid. Yellow represents kids that are working at a grade below. And then our red could be 2 or 3 years below grade level. So you can see we have a healthy number of kids who need us to accelerate with them to get them to back up to grade level. And our numbers in reading are different. So 35% of our students are making progress towards annual typical growth, which is good news and bad news. It's not as high as math, but we were doing more poorly in math. So maybe having more growth there is, indicating that we are focused on that. Higher numbers of students have gone up and changed placement levels 45% rather than the 38 we saw with math. Okay, you ready to dive in more? So here's what we're looking at is how many kids are in each of these bands. So remember, the green is pretty much where we want them. Yellow is, oops, they're kind of sliding down, getting towards a year below. And then red is like, holy cow, we got to get on it here. We first had this looking at fall and winter. Then we asked for kids where we had the data. Well, can we see how they left last year and came into this year? So for example, for our kindergarten, our current first graders, they're on that second line there. So it says kindergarten 22 spring. And you can see that 78% of our kids last year left kindergarten pretty well off. They're on grade level. The light green could be early on grade level, so it's kind of hard to say that they're totally on grade level. And we had some discussion around, does that mean, do we want kids to be above grade level when they lead us, or is it okay to be solidly on grade level? But these are the kinds of great discussions that we want teachers to have, is what does this mean and how are we interpreting this data? And we didn't have any kids leaving us last year in kindergarten in the red. So that's excellent. When we look at how they came in at fall and then how they did at winter, you see quite a bit of dip. And I'm thinking at first, I'm like, gosh, that's a whole lot of summer learning loss. But actually upon digging in, they left kindergarten being measured on kindergarten standards. And then in the fall, they're measured on first grade standards. So it would make sense that they don't come in as high as they left kindergarten. Give me a nod if you get that. And we'll just keep trucking on. Thanks.
I do. Can I just ask?
Yes.
So the fall standards, though, are they calibrated for early first grade standards? Or are they like the whole first grade standards?
I asked that same question and it looks like it's mid-year.
Okay, great.
So we would
Surprise,
expect
surprise,
them not to
surprise.
necessarily be killing it the beginning of the year because they haven't learned that stuff yet.
Thank you.
But I wanted to see sort of a longitudinal look at how are our kids leaving us from one grade, coming in at the next, and where will they leave their next grade, to know where do we have pockets of strength and where do we need to think about beefing up some of our practices and materials. Okay, so you can see reading and math side by side for the little ones, that's K1, 2. And then we have the same for 3, 4, 5. I'm just going to let you look at these and I won't talk through the whole thing. What do you notice about the difference from primary to middle grades?
We have a lot more kids that are in the 2 grades or more below.
Mhm.
But then again, they have more grades that they can fall behind in, right?
It's
When you're in
true. Hard to be
kindergarten,
grades
you
below.
can't really be 2 years behind, but
And these
So
are
that
some of
was-
our kids who are most affected by the pandemic.
But can I ask a clarifying question on the K?
Mhm.
It's not really possible to be in the red in kindergarten, right? Because you can't be 2 grades behind.
Right.
Okay, so we wouldn't necessarily start capturing that until they got a little later in school.
You could see
Or-
like in that spring score, they probably couldn't
Yeah.
get 2 years behind, but they could be behind where you'd want them for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely, I mean, I think there's a contrast between our ELA and math for sure.
Mhm. Okay, let's look at the next grade band. So this is 6th, 7th, and 8th. Any trends that you're noticing? I have a couple that I'm thinking of. I don't want to just shout them out there. I was wondering if anybody else saw stuff.
it's interesting on the reading for 6th, 7th, and 8th. The level doesn't really change. Like in the fall, like they're 24% are mid or above grade level, and 28%, 28. It's like going up just incrementally. We're not like really kicking it. Like everybody seems to be kind of staying where they were when they started the school year.
There's a lot of, the standards don't change that much from grade to grade at this age, but they get more sophisticated. And so it's a little bit harder to show drastic growth, in my opinion. But I am noticing that as a district, when our kids are in the green, so to speak, they tend to stay in the green. And what
Yes.
we want to learn to do is push more kids into that. And we're good at keeping them there, and we need to push more kids in. So that's kind of as we think about where we headed with universal design and some of our, the way that we want to talk about instructional practice, these are the questions that we want to be able to ask teachers and get feedback on how do we move this along?
And math just is stinky. That's all I'm
Mhm.
going to say. Math is stinky.
Well, but I mean, I think it also is not just the students that are in the green stay in the green, but there's more students falling in the red as they progress through middle school. So, I mean, not with reading necessarily, but math. So, how do we support?
Right, and we're really interested to see how our kids who are in 6th grade this year will do with the more intense focus on professional learning that their teachers have received. So they've gotten a lot of PD, they've gotten a lot of coaching, and we're hoping we see some result of that.
Mhm.
Really interested in our K-5 math, for example. We have a really good set of instructional materials, and we're not seeing what we want to see. And so we want to say, well, why? What's going on? What do we need to learn to do better?
This is a high level snapshot, and I mean, you can't show us every priority group and every, breakdown, but I'm curious where some of the trends, especially like what the trends are of these students that progress from 6 to 8, losing ground, what pockets of students are falling in, just to see how do we focus our tools and our supports.
And I'd like to line those students up with their attendance and their panorama scores and be able to see the whole picture. Are these kids who are choosing not to come to that class, or are they, do they need to work? Like what are their circumstances that are creating this profile? So, yeah.
Absolutely.
And then there's the chicken and the egg. Like, were they coming like in their previous, iReady scores, like in 4th or 5th grade, were they like in the green or the yellow and they were coming more, but then they started slipping into the red and now they're not coming. So it's because they're not feeling successful, which is just exacerbating the problem?
Right.
Like, is it the not attendance causing the growth issue, or is it the growth issue that contributes to attendance, which then also causes a growth issue?
What's that cycle like? And then I think middle schools across the nation are really struggling to understand how to connect better with kids and what do kids need right now. And a lot of it is really social emotional needs, and that definitely contributes to how they're engaging with instructional materials. So there's good news, bad news, right? We're in great miserable company along with all the other people who are trying to figure out middle schoolers.
I was, I guess I was just looking at that mainly. It seems to be that fall is kind of where a lot of the students are more on the red. How does like summer school, I guess, play into a lot of these scores? Like, I guess, is there a way of knowing those students who did summer school? Like, does it really benefit them? Is it really supporting them in improving their, I guess, for reading or math?
There's a lot of research to show that summer school doesn't necessarily help, but that year-round school, for example, helps, where you just have kind of continuous, but you don't have these giant gaps. Summer school where only some kids have to go, and it's only a couple of weeks. I don't think there's a lot of efficacy in that, but kind of rethinking what would it look like to not have that slide happen.
Yeah.
You're already behind, and then you got to go to 6th grade and you're already behind, and there's a lot of how do we connect those dots. Definitely.
Yeah, there was just a research paper, I think I heard in the last like 2 weeks, about the whole middle school, the whole summer school not really offering much change in where kids land when they come back from the, to the fall, and that really modified calendar is the best way to help kids not slide.
And our own VPS data showed that before the pandemic, when people were offering summer literacy academy, that didn't pan out like people hoped it would. All right, what's next, boss? This is part of that good news, bad news sort of thing. Like this is how we compare to historic national norms. I was surprised actually that it's not that much worse than pre-pandemic. And then national norms for winter this year, and winter in Washington, and winter in Vancouver. And we're right in the mix with everybody else nationally. And so we're, again, good, miserable company. We're all kind of doing the same dance of, we've got a lot of kids in the yellow, and then we've got a fair amount of kids that have really fallen behind.
This is always so intriguing to me because comparison is hard. I mean, it's validating, but also hard to look at. I'd be curious if any of our research teams could look at aspirational comparator districts, like where specifically Washington, because I think learning standards are different state by state. But if we could establish a couple comparator districts that look like us, size comparable, but that could be aspirational in terms of growth they've seen, or some of the implementations they've done that are in alignment with what we're working towards. I think not that we want to see underperformance, but where we can see progress towards a goal versus we're in miserable company, but we're,
Yep.
I don't know if that makes sense. I'm sorry. I've had a long day of
It
learning,
does.
but
And we measure growth, and yet we see it's not getting us where we want. So who is doing it? Who's growing the 1.5 or 2 years so that they're actually making their data get
because there's
better?
a lot of districts on similar journeys and maybe a couple of years ahead of us. National data is so hard. Statewide is more anchoring to me, but if there was a few districts out there, specifically in Washington, that we could just anchor towards. I think that'd be interesting to kind of, as we continue this evolution of monitoring student learning.
Definitely, and a fun and optimistic project also.
Mhm.
You want to see the same for math? Quite similar.
So one thing I'm sorry, I'm on a different device than I usually use, so I can't see anyone but the presenter. So I do not mean to be interrupting my colleagues. I just want to say that. But one thing I am noticing is that our we're consistent except in that red area.
Mhm.
And that was similar to the middle school grade band in terms of we were growing in that significantly behind. So, just questions around that.
Yes, and is that just in middle school or elsewhere? Yeah, I don't know if you saw the little notation on the other slides. We didn't have enough high school students yet
Mhm.
participate to really gather their data. They're still making the adjustment to being part of this data set. So
So just to kind of layer on top of what Christy presented, we're using iReady as one indicator and hoping to grow in our common assessments and opportunities to really understand how our students are doing. So we also looked at classroom-based assessments and particular grades at the secondary level. And we looked at that for ELA and math again. For high school, it was first semester grades, and for middle school, it was first trimester grades. And we just compared between this year and last year. What we did is sort the grades into two groups, one where it was credit earning and one where it was not. Recognizing that, a D maybe doesn't represent standard proficiency, but in terms of being able to earn a credit, it does count. So, and then we pulled all that data into just the curiosity I had is like, are we assessing the same? Like, is this aligning with the other iReady indicator? And what we're seeing here as we look at ELA on the top, that we're pretty consistent, slightly assigning more Fs or no credits when we look at ELA in middle school. Because these are the pass rates, so they're kind of slightly going down, so more Fs in those. And then the similar at math, pretty consistent, but still more students are failing this year than they were last year at that first semester and trimester time. And so that's something that sometimes we'll say as educators, well, it's a standard-based assessment, and that's like, it doesn't measure all that goes into effect of what's happening with the student, but these are grades that we're determining, right, as professionals in our system with the context that we have. And so there's curiosity about that too, right? Like, what's happening, what are we seeing, and how can we learn and grow in terms of supporting our students better. And then in the presentation, there's also a bunch of background slides. So if you're curious about like, well, what about the difference between B+ and C and like some of that, the tables just get kind of big for presenting in a board meeting kind of format, but they're rich to dive in deeper. So I'll pause here and see. I know this is a much shorter part of the presentation than what Christy walked through with the iReady growth data, but it's an important indicator as well.
I'm going to jump in here, Jeff, as the resident high school teacher on the board. This is not at all surprising to me to see more failing grades, I guess, issued this year as opposed to last. We were still coming, just anecdotally, based on my experiences with my colleagues in my school where I teach. There was still a lot of grace being extended to students in terms of extended due dates and getting some creative solutions for how to find some students some credit, just because knowing that students were going to be, there was a lot of students absent because of symptom tracing and then actual COVID and whatnot. Whereas this year, it doesn't seem to be quite as much grace extended. Maybe we're going back a little bit more to our more standard policies around due dates and things like that. I think that might just be a natural occurrence of coming out of the pandemic again. I know the year before this, you're going to see significantly higher passing rates if you look at 2021 because of what OSPI had required of secondary schools for grade as far as grades were concerned. So that's not at all surprising. What I'd be curious to see, and it's going back even farther, would be to even compare possibly this year to pre-pandemic failure rates.
Thank you.
I really appreciate just kind of this secondary glance at where our students are. So we're not just singularly focused on iReady. Obviously, iReady and SBA comes with their own limitations, complications, biases. I think I apologize because I just came off of a day full of learning around a lot of essential standards and so forth. So I'm anchored in this, how does our grading practices align with our standards mastery? And so I think for me going forward, it'd be interesting to break down not just passing rate, but really differentiate between the A's, the B's, the C's, and the D's. Because if we're thinking that, what does a C mean versus what does an A mean of really rising above that standard, and then you compare that against our learning data, you're thinking, oh, does that really make sense? So I'd be interested in because I love data, and iReady is an easy data point because we capture it, but it doesn't tell the whole picture. So I'd really love to have, I think, maybe a little bit more extrapolation on the more formative assessments or grading, just as that juxtaposition.
Yeah, that makes sense. And historically as well, right? To try to, and recognizing that to Director Smith's point, that 2021 probably isn't a baseline year. So how do we find that? And then also, how do we recognize that by doing this consistently now post-pandemic with the equity policy, that we are also establishing a baseline, right?
Mm-hmm.
So kind of using that as leverage for whatever we want to do in the future, and how we want to prioritize resources to support the opportunities that we see.
Well, and also, gosh, again, I'm not an educator, I'm just learning a lot. But looking back pre-pandemic is very good historically. However, there's also, I think, a trend going towards standards mastery and less busy work. So what do these grades mean, and what are they reflecting? So I think there's probably should be some similarity between grades and assessments, but they probably wouldn't marry up completely.
I think you would find that discrepancy pretty minimal, actually. The trend towards standards-based, that's not a new, within the last couple of years, trend. Certainly, I would say that's more of a 15-year trend, where teachers are going more towards standards-based grading. So I would be curious to see, just out of curiosity, how it compares to pre-pandemic passage rates. But I think it would be also useful to see it broken down by a smaller grades, A, B, C, etc. I have a question for Christy, actually. I'm sorry to jump back to iReady just for a second. When we give the iReady assessment and students are flagged, what do we do with those students? Are they put into the data that we just looked at? Are they pulled out from the data? Do we make them take it again? Like, what happens to those flagged students?
Flagged for what, rushing or?
Yeah,
I don't think they're asked to retake it again on the spot. I think it's more of a coaching about how to approach the test. And
so
that's,
is that included in the data we just saw then with their scores being
Yes.
included in that? Okay,
and that's actually a problem that we are learning that we need to address with students is how to approach this test. It really shouldn't take you 6 periods. It should take 1 or 2 periods at the most. And if you don't get a question, you don't perseverate, you just go on. And because that's kind of part of the bad rap that iReady and MAP and tests like that get is we have to be really insistent with what we're trying to get out of it. Kids need to understand, teachers need to understand so that it doesn't become really onerous. And then
I have found in my, in Evergreen, where we have started administering, so I gave iReady test to my students in my history class this year. Getting my high school students, especially when they're, juniors and seniors, to take it seriously is not an easy thing.
Right.
And so just kind of wrap our heads around the higher the grade level we're looking at, the less accurate that data is going to be. I saw some really interesting scores come back from some of my strongest students where I'm like, I know you're not reading at a 3rd grade level, but that's what you came back at. So anyway, that's just something important to keep in mind. And I'm curious if, and I don't know in terms of validity of data, if this is the right answer, but is it possible to pull those students that got flagged for rushing from that data?
And I can check my assumption too and make sure that what I said was correct. I believe they're still in there. But I think that's part of the data set that we have. When we look at middle school and so many kids in the red, I don't think that's necessarily a skill reflection. I think a lot of that is a will reflection,
Right.
and an interest. And that's part of our data literacy project is how do we interest kids in their own growth and setting goals to grow more.
Yeah. And on that note, I would add looking at grades for trimester, semester grades is also going to be often a will over skill in terms of what's reflected back in those letter grades. So.
And I would say too that it's not just like at the high school level, but I think at the kindergarten level, they're very much of the mindset, the quicker I go, the sooner I'm done. And they don't, and I know back when I was giving it to my kinders that the ones that finished like the whole thing in 30 minutes, they got flagged. And then our instructional coach came back and had them redo it. So I do know in that case that the ones that like just whizzed right through it and obviously didn't know what they were doing, when they got flagged, they were asked to redo it, right, with the instructional coach. But
Okay, I'm gonna keep us moving. We've got one last set, and then we have Principal Mandy Green from Marshall to just kind of talk about, okay, we saw this data, we wanted to wrap up with like, okay, but what's it look like at a school? So I'll turn it back over to you, Christy.
And again, this is just a teaser. So we're doing some advertising around why is it important to learn another language? So why be in dual language? Why take world language? And so we linked this in here for you. This is some of the advertising that we're doing for parents. We retooled some of that. Jessica Roberts has been really helpful in helping us become better marketers. We wanted to tell a better and different story about why it's important to have more than one language. So next one. So we're looking at how many kids are currently receiving multilingual services. We're looking at what are the languages that our kids speak, and we're looking at who's getting or how many kids are getting credit for the world language courses that they are taking either through dual language or through world language in middle school and high school. So this next shot is a screenshot from our dashboard that the DART has been working to create for anyone to look at, but essentially for the multilingual department to use. So you can see what the languages are and how many families and kids speak those. We're looking at about 3,400 multilingual students. And to the right of the circle, you can see what kinds of services they're receiving in VPS. So 900 of them are in content ESL, which is a fancy way of saying that they go to a specific class for English language development, what we used to call ESL. And those are typically in middle school and high school where you have a standalone class for that. We have 226 that are in newcomer program. And you can see this is the old language where we don't really use EL anymore. We use multilingual. We don't really say newcomer anymore. We say recently arrived. So we're looking at asset-based language, but these are things that are pulled off of Skyward. So Skyward is a little behind the rest of us as we're trying to think about assets. And again, just a reminder that our newcomers in middle school will not all go to MAC next year. They'll be welcomed in their homeschool so they can stay in school with their friends and their neighbors. About 2,000 kids in supportive mainstream, which means that they're in every classroom in schools and they are being supported to develop language by their classroom teacher, sometimes in collaboration with a multilingual specialist or teacher who would be helping co-teach or co-plan. But we also expect all of our teachers to be able to use language development strategies that help kids access the content in English. Currently 342 are in dual language. And then we only have 4 whose parents declined language services for our kids. And then the last one shows you who's taking what in world language. And this is a newer project for us that we're going to embark in, is really what world languages do we want to offer? How can we make world language pathways to mirror kind of a CTE pathway? How do we really highlight this as an excellent opportunity for our kids? You can see that there were 1,362 language assessments taken by 9th through 12th grade students in 19 different languages. So that's the Avant or the STAMP test, and they can get high school credit for that. So that's also part of our project, is really capturing who these kids are, the credits that they're getting, and ensuring that those credits go successfully to high school. So they're not repeating, like if they've got 5 credits in Spanish, we don't want them back in Spanish too. We want them to then learn another language or something, or go into AP or something like that. So, and those are the credits so far that kids have earned taking the Avant test. So it's, again, we want to highlight, this is a huge strength for our district. We want to highlight this and help kids capitalize on the assets that they bring to us and make sure that those count for high school.
So one question on that. I'd be curious on the Avant proficient, or those that are taking these tests, those who have gone through a program, you know, programmatically through K-12, or they did something dual language and then they went on to take the test, versus how are we capturing the students who might be capable but not necessarily have participated in a program? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's part of our project, learning that, well, shoot, we have a ton of kids who speak a bunch of different things. If they're already proficient and literate in that language, they should get credit for that. And then they can go on to take another language in school or other electives, whatever they choose to do. So part of it is, again, this is a marketing issue. We need our teachers to understand the potential here. We want more people to be interested in the seal of biliteracy. You don't have to have gone through a dual language program to get that. So some of it is internal, that we need to get our program alignment together, get our advertising together, get the word out, and make sure that we're looking for these kids. And not just through multilingual services, but that every teacher knows if this is an asset that kids bring, and are they proficient enough to get credit out of it. So it's in some places it's a common practice and it's well established, and in others not yet. So we want to make that more consistent across the district.
One more quick question. On the previous slide, it showed students and how they were served. So if you're in a dual language program and you are native, let's say Spanish speaker, so you're captured there in that 342. Okay. So as
And
we,
here to the
if we,
state, most of our kids should be captured that way. So we
Right.
have a
So as we continue maybe to grow the, secondary pathway, or as we continue to offer more, there's going to be maybe a transition between that supportive mainstream to maybe dual language, or, yeah, okay.
Yes, and kids that, in order to get the dual language designation, they have to have 50% of their classes in middle school and in high school. So that takes a lot of forethought and recruitment, because they have to be licensed and they have to be bilingual also. So, but that's a big piece of our puzzle.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you want to hear from Mandy, where the rubber hits the road, with the first year principal who's absolutely crushing it?
Isn't she amazing?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to get to talk with you guys a little bit more about the work we're doing at Marshall. So I know coming to Marshall as my first year this year, data was really, really important to me. So I was able to meet with our student improvement team, and we kind of looked at our data. So we really dove into our panorama data and our iReady data. And looking at it, we still had some opportunities for building a sense of belonging. I know last spring we had about 63% of our kids who felt like they belonged in the school, but I worried, what about the 37% that aren't? So what are we going to do to help support that, all of our kids and our families? And then looking at our iReady data, we focused a lot on phonics and high frequency words, but then we were really dipping in vocabulary and comprehensive. So we've been really focusing on that area. And then in math, we've been focusing on numbers and operations, because if we don't have that foundational skills, it's really hard to continue moving. So after we've created these priority focuses, we first looked at a sense of belonging. I looked at our winter data. We're still not where I'd like us to be. We're at about 69% of our school feeling like they belong overall. But one win that I felt was really great about our school is that 80% of the students feel that an adult supports them at school. So kind of diving into how we've done some of these supports for our kids is we really broke it into how are we going to do some tier 1 supports for the whole school, tier 2 for a smaller portion of our school, and then like our tier 3 supports for hopefully about 5 to 10% of our school. So looking at it, one of the things that we implemented was community circles. So if you were to come into our building, you would see teachers opening up their classrooms, doing community circle, getting the kids engaged, and then usually you'd see at the end of the day. We also starting to do some restorative circles for if there's a problem in class, how do we make it right and make everybody feel like they're connected and belonging? Another thing is we've worked really hard with our counselor to work on second step. So we're really infusing that social and emotional learning for all students. We have a scope and sequence that we follow, and then our character traits are in alignment with the second steps that we're working on. Another thing is I'm really excited that we are starting a student-centered equity team. We're piloting it, and actually our parents today just met together to meet each other and kind of figure out what that work was. But we hope that that's going to bring more belonging with not just our kids, but also our families feeling connection. Another thing that we're working on is just really toning in and honing our multi-tiered systems of support for MTSS, because we do have a lot of kids that need support, but making sure we're giving them the correct intervention to help them and to make sure that they're feeling like they are connected with our school. Another thing that I love that we implemented with our PBIS coach this year is we have what's called our breakfast club. And so it's similar to check in, check out, but it's for our kids that just need a little bit more of a connection in the morning. So they go and grab breakfast and come back and have it with me in my office. Or if they don't like the breakfast, I have a whole bunch of proteins and carbs and juice, because we know if our kids haven't eaten, they're not ready to start the day. So we just do that. And then if the kids are having a rough night from the night before, they sit and talk with me about it. And we make sure they're really at baseline before they go into class. And I found from doing this, most of the kids that check in with me, I'm not seeing them later throughout the day. They're staying in class, they're getting their work done. So it's been a really positive tier 2 intervention. We've also saw through the pandemic, our youngest learners are really struggling with emotional regulation. So our counselor has implemented Slumberkins, which are these cool books that have little characters with them. And it's just really helped with our kids to kind of have some of that emotional regulation within school. And then I think the biggest support we've had so far this year is we started a pilot program where we have a mental health coordinator that's part of the time in our school and part of the time at King. And since we've seen more students that are having more mental health issues and needing more counseling support, she meets with them and the family and works with them from the very beginning all the way until they've actually gotten the counseling resources, sits and calls and makes the appointments with them. So we have just seen that teachers are feeling more supported, kids are feeling more supported, and we're seeing that change of them just feeling like they have support in the school. And then for tier 3 support, we're really working on having some BSPs put in place for kids so that they're very honed in interventions for the kids that then follows them from grade level to grade level. And then also, since we are community practice schools, we are starting what is called collaborative practice solutions, which I really enjoy because it's really helping with students that have trauma, and how do we create them, like some interventions put in place to help them reach their goals and stay in class and get their learning done. So that's what we're working on, sense of belonging. If you want to go to the next slide, is where we're talking about PLC work, because I've told everybody PLC isn't something we do. It's who we are. It's how we do business. So it's kind of like I told everybody, this is the umbrella. This is what we do, and everything is going to fall within it. And so in August, our building really jumped on having a guiding coalition. So we created our guiding coalition in August, which is a representative of every grade level, even our preschoolers. So we have a preschool rep. And then with it, we started meeting twice a month, but we felt as we're just kind of getting in the process that once a month was better. So we did do some changes. We meet once a month. And then the other time I meet with my co-lead, where we kind of plan out what the meetings would look like. Also, I know our staff has always been asking for more time for PLCs. So now one of our weekly staff meetings is based on PLCs. And then within it, we've really been working on unwrapping us. So first, what we did is we looked at the scope and sequence, because we were noticing that some teachers were teaching the standards, but at different times. And so if you went to one teacher, you might see something different in another classroom. And so we wanted to make sure that every kid had a guaranteed viable curriculum, no matter what teacher they had. So there was no lottery of getting the certain teacher, but you were getting the same experience. So we worked on doing the scope and sequence. Now we're working on unwrapping a standard that we found from preschool all the way to 5th grade. And they're working on unwrapping it. Next up, we're going to do some vertical teaming so they can see what the grade level below has, what the grade level above has. So we're really in line step. And then we have decided, as we're going more towards standard mastery, as opposed to just having like a common formative assessment, we're working on proficiency rubrics. So what would it look like if they were proficient in that skill? Because that's really teaming into the universal design for learning work that we're doing in our building, where we want to have firm goals, but flexible means for them to show that they've met that assessment. So for example, is the assessment a writing assessment, or is it really reading? Because if it's reading, could they do a video to show that they've met proficiency? Do they have to write it out? So just kind of getting our kids more engaged and seeing if they really understand the standard. I know through this process, we've had a lot of challenges and wins. The number one challenge we've had is just time. Everybody wants more time. How do I carve it out? So I know now I'm looking at doing 2 staff meetings a month that are on PLC work. We started doing more every like 4 to 8 weeks. We're doing data team meetings with our team. And then it was originally just in the morning. I'm now giving them release time for the whole day so they can look at the data and then use that data to inform their instruction and start working on some of those PLC questions. What are you going to do if they know it? What if they don't know it? And how are we going to intervene so they're getting time to do that? I know that in a perfect world, I keep looking at next year, how do I give them more time? So I know we're starting to get creative of how do we use our teacher librarian. I'm trying to see if I can miraculously come up with money to get a makerspace teacher so that extra 5th day, we can make it as release time, because that's not part of their planning, so that we can give them more time, because this is really the work that's going to show that growth we need to make in academics. And so I know our teachers are feeling it too. And all the time they're always asking me, how do we get more time? And so that just shows me how much this work is important to them, that, you know, we're seeing the results. It's just slow and steady. So that's kind of where we're at with our academics and sense of belonging. I was going to open up if you guys have any questions on that.
Thank you, Mandy. We really wanted to kind of end tonight with that. You know, it's really important for us to look at the high level data and to talk about that at a board policy level, but then also just remember that we have all these amazing teams across our district and schools that are trying to take that higher level data down to the granular level and affect the instructional experience for our students on every given day. And so I'll pause and see if there are any questions for Mandy before we wrap this up.
Keep doing what you're doing. Seems like you're doing a great job.
Mandy, you are killing it, girl.
I just wanted to say thank you. I've gotten to see some of your PLC work in action, and I appreciate seeing how the data then informs the practice.
Okay, well, that's a lot of content for tonight. We started with the budget, right? We got an update on the programs of choice and schools of choice. We looked at highly capable, the committee work, and a preview of some recommendations that might be coming after their last meeting. And then we looked at belonging data, attendance data, multilingual data, student learning data, and then we got to hear from a practitioner and leader in our schools. So we will be coming back later in spring. Spring's 3 weeks away. I'm ready for it. Like looking at that forecast again tonight. But we'll have another data dive in the spring, and then we'll have our last one, kind of the culminating one, more towards June-ish kind of thing. But the comments that were given tonight, we've noted, but also as you reflect on the experience and you look more at the slides, please let us know how we can kind of continue to tailor this. Like I said, I would love to have these presentations archived so that, you know, to some of the points earlier, that we would just pull up in 2025, 26, we'd pull up the 22, 23 presentation, and we would be able to see that through line of the work and the investment that we've made in and the impact on student outcomes as a result. So that's all I have, Director Zavala. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Any other last remarks or comments? No?
I just have one, and I just like to say this evening was so positive, and it just made me so proud to be part of this school district, because the people that presented tonight have so much talent and so much passion around what they're doing. And it's just it's an exciting time to be part of this system. And those people that presented tonight, wow, they're really impressive. So
Thank you.
Thank you. So that is the end of our meeting today at 7:12 p.m. Our next board meeting will be on March 14th at 5:30 at the Bates, and virtual as well. So thank you.
thank you.